because, he was a neighbour.
It was a real inner feeling, we've got to solve this for this young kid here.
Obviously an evil man. I would find it hard to forgive him.
In our minds, there was more to tell. This couldn't be the first time that he'd done this.
On Sunday, November the 26th, 2000, a worried mother called the police, telling them that her daughter hadn't come home after Christmas shopping. When initial inquiries proved fruitless, West Yorkshire Police launched Operation Conifer, one of the largest missing persons investigations in their history. Despite all their efforts, it was 9 excruciating months before they found out what had happened to her. Bramley in West Yorkshire is a suburb of the city of Leeds. Once a picturesque village with a rich industrial past, it was redeveloped into the Bramley of today, but it has retained its strong sense of community.
People do gather, look after one another, so to speak, and like to see one another and have a chat.
Everybody knows everybody. They are pretty friendly. I don't know any nasty person that lives in Bramley as a community.
At 7 p.m. on Sunday, the 26th of November 2000, West Yorkshire Police received a phone call from a Sharon Hawkshead, reporting her 16-year-old daughter, Leanne Tiernan, missing.
Her mother gave us a description, and that was of a 16-year-old girl, slightly built. She was under 7 stones, with long brown hair, light brown hair.
Police immediately got to work interviewing family and friends to piece together her movements that day.
She waved goodbye to her family and set off on the short bus ride into Leeds with her best friend, Sarah, to buy some Christmas presents. Leanne bought Sarah some jewellery for Christmas, and she put those in her pocket, and they caught the bus back then from the city centre back to their home at Bramley. Leanne got off the bus with Sarah at Sarah's stop, which was 2 or 3 stops before where Leanne would have ordinarily got off. But Leanne, being the kind of girl she was, she wanted to make sure Sarah got home safely. And by waving Sarah off where she did, near to Sarah's home, that meant that as she entered the darkness of Huffley Gill.
By this time it was 5 p.m. Huffley Gill was a secluded, tree-covered ravine with a path at the bottom. It was no place for a young girl on her own, even one in a hurry to get home.
It would have taken Leanne probably about 20 minutes to walk from that point to get home. It was just over half a mile, between half a mile and 3/4 of a mile.
At 5:30, Sarah rang Leanne's home, but Leanne wasn't there. Mum Sharon was concerned, but when she found out what route her daughter had taken, concern soon turned to alarm.
She realised that she'd walked through Huffley Gill, which is pitch black at that time of day, even though it was only 5 o'clock. Leanne's mum started ringing Leanne's phone frantically. It rang for about 20 times and just rang off. She rang it again. It rang for 4 times and then was seemingly cut off. Panic started to set in from that point on. And after a quick search round the Gill by family and Sarah and friends, the alarm was raised and Leanne was reported missing.
It was now 7 p.m. and Leanne had only been missing a few hours, but police knew time was of the essence. The case was assigned to Chris Gregg, who was a detective superintendent at that time.
From the outset, when Leanne was reported missing, you hope that there's just going to be an innocent explanation, that she'll return, she's gone off to her friends, or there's a secret boyfriend that mum and dad don't know about.
Police started searching immediately, and it soon became clear just how massive the task facing them was.
That area is quite a dense urban area, a lot of areas to search. There's an area with lots of housing, commercial premises, there's a river, there's a canal, there are drainage shafts, there are whole range of search areas that had to be considered.
The next morning, with Leanne now missing for 12 hours, Operation Conifer was launched. The hunt for Leanne was on.
And it was important that we literally, to use the cliche, left no stone unturned. And the search teams went through here, searching the whole area for anything as small as the small items of jewellery that we knew Leanne had bought that day for a friend, looking for the mobile phone, an umbrella, any telltale sign which could help us explain what had happened to Leanne.
It wasn't long before everyone in the community heard the news.
It did make people more cautious. There was lots of different rumours going round, but nobody really knew anything.
It was clear that an early forensic response would be needed, so DSI Greg called in the Forensic Science Service, or FSS.
Well, we became involved in the Leanne Tiernan case almost from the outset, once she had gone missing. For reference purposes, if she was found or if an offender came to light, we needed to know her DNA profile and we needed to get her fingerprints. So we actually took her toothbrush and got a DNA profile from that and matched that in with profiles from her parents. And we were also able to obtain her fingerprints from her diary.
After 5 days, the search was still coming up empty-handed, despite the police's best efforts.
The scale of the search to find Leanne was huge. It was one of the biggest search operations the force had ever undertaken. It involved 200 officers, specialist search advisors. It involved the dog section, the mounted section, the underwater search teams.
Peter Grant and his forensic team did what they could under trying circumstances.
The difficulty we faced was that there was no clear scene for us to focus on. There was the last sighting on the bus, and she was also intending to walk all the way home, and the scene could have been anywhere between those 2 points, which was quite a large area. Because a lot of areas were being searched, a lot of items started coming in, but they weren't ones that ended up being relevant to the case.
Getting nowhere, on the 3rd of December, 1 week after Leanne Tiernan had last been seen, the police turned to the media for help.
We staged the reconstruction and they followed the same route, right to the point where Leanne had been last seen. Now, what struck me when we were doing the reconstruction, which was how black Huffley Gill was. I was just staggered at the vulnerable position she was putting herself in when she entered that gill.
Once aired, the response was immediate.
Following the reconstruction, we were starting to piece together some interesting sightings that people were telling us about and sounds that people had heard, and 2 were of interest to us. One was a lady who said that in the weeks leading up to Leanne's disappearance, she'd seen a man, a rough-looking guy, with a dog, hanging around the entrance to Huffley Gill. And she was a little bit uneasy about this guy because he was trying to engage the children into conversation, the school children.
Straight away, the police got the witness to describe the man she'd seen, to produce an image.
Another lady remembered hearing a scream around the time that we know Leanne would have just about entered the gill. And that again, it might have been connected, it might not, but these 2 pieces of information were important to us.
On December the 4th, police published the EFIT.
We were looking at people in that area who walked through the gill with dogs, and we questioned and found lots of them. We eliminated them all.
With the search still in full swing, officers found out everything they could about the schoolgirl they were looking for.
Leanne was a typical 16-year-old girl who was a lot to live for. She had this radiant smile. She would do anything for anybody. She looked after her grandma, went to church with her, even though she wasn't particularly keen on going to church every Sunday morning, but she did it for her grandma's sake. She'd been in the Brownies, went into the Girl Guides, and she had a group of friends, very popular girl.
Sister Janet Durbin was the minister at the Methodist chapel where the family worshipped.
Leanne did stand out because she was always bright and shiny, always helpful, and she used to like to carry the flag for the brownies and the guides. And as she grew older, we started a Saturday night fellowship for the teenagers, and she used to be one that asked a lot of questions. We talked about all kinds of things that were going on in the world, and she was always up with a hand up and helping. And then Leanne used to like helping in the kitchen, preparing the pizzas and chips and things. It's just a normal young girl.
After 3 weeks, there were still no useful clues, yet police kept on going.
All the time, you're racking your brains. Where is she? What can have happened to her? We've searched 1,100 houses. We've searched drainage shafts, wells, railway lines, canal. We even lowered the canal, almost pulled the plug out and drained it down because it was easier and quicker to search it that way over 3 miles. And we still hadn't found her.
Over the next few months, police continued searching and questioning people of interest. But it was as if Leanne had disappeared into thin air.
The feeling and the belief that they will still be found safe and well never goes away. And I'm sure that is the case with anybody who's facing that particular situation of a young loved one particularly who's disappeared, that they'll be found ultimately. And personally and professionally, you know that the chances of being found safe and well are slim.
By July, Operation Conifer was in its 8th month, and although the physical searching had all but ended, the police hadn't stopped looking.
The network across the UK was fairly extensive that Leanne was missing, and we were getting calls periodically that a body had been found, and we were checking out. We got Leanne's DNA, so we could quickly eliminate anyone who had been found during that intervening period while she was missing.
On August 20th, 2001, almost 9 months after Leanne's disappearance, DSI Greg received some news that changed the investigation completely. Almost 9 months had gone by without a single clue as to where missing 16-year-old schoolgirl Leanne Tiernan from Brownlee in Yorkshire had gone. The longer Leanne remained missing, the more the police suspected the worst. Then police got a call that was to change everything.
A dog walker was in the woods and saw what he thought was a bundle of rubbish that somebody had dumped. And he went over to the bundle and realised that it wasn't rubbish. There was something which he thought was a dead animal in the bags. And he gingerly opened the duvet cover and saw that there was some plastic sacks tied with twine at the top. And he broke into one of the bags and realised this wasn't a dead animal, it was a dead person.
Over the months, police had found dozens of bodies around the country that hadn't been Leanne.
But this one immediately felt different. It wasn't far from where Leanne had been last seen, only 16 miles. The body had been left in a shallow grave, and this just had all the hallmarks of somebody trying to dispose of a body quickly.
Immediately, the scene was meticulously searched.
So when our forensic team started uncovering this, it was found that the girl's body had been encased in 10 plastic bags and had been encased top and tail. So the first bag had been used to put the girl's body in, tied at the top with twine, and then a bag put the opposite direction, tied with twine. And the final bag had been secured around the girl's neck with an 18-inch leather dog collar with a buckle. That parcel had then been put into the duvet cover, and the duvet cover had been used to carry that parcel into the woods. Capturing evidence from this point onwards was going to be crucial for what seemed as though a major crime had been committed.
The decision was made to then retrieve that package intact and take it back to the pathology where it could be thoroughly examined and forensic samples taken, hopefully.
Having examined the crime scene, a profile of the perpetrator began to emerge.
I think the state of the body, particularly the use of ties and the later wrapping and marks of injury, did suggest that the perpetrator had approached this in a coldly efficient, ruthless kind of way.
The packaged body of the unknown girl was taken to the nearest mortuary at Harrogate. DSI Gregg followed soon after.
Living and breathing a case like this for months, I knew this girl. I knew everything about this girl. And the worst possible outcome was that she was now on this table in front of me. And I knew it was her from the moment I looked at her. And I've never had a feeling like it before or since. And there was just something at that moment in time that was so powerful, an emotion, that it was a real inner feeling, we've got to solve this for this young kid here.
Once the bags were opened, evidence was found that would prove key in identifying the killer.
When we found her, she had got her hands tied behind her back with 3 cable ties. And there were 2 black cable ties and a yellow one. The black one was around one wrist, the yellow one around her other wrist, and they were connected between the 2 with another black cable tie, like a daisy chain in effect, and her hands tied behind her back. She'd been strangled with 2 ligatures. One was a dark woolen scarf with a red stripe running through it, and the other was a clear-coloured cable tie that was around her neck and pulled very tightly.
The pathologist was joined by one of Peter Grant's team.
It was very important that we had a forensic scientist at the scene, and she'd actually identified a tuft of fibre on the back of the jumper.
Although DSI Gregg felt certain the body was that of Leanne, a formal identification had to occur.
We already had her fingerprints that we'd taken from her diary, and we were actually able to compare those with the fingerprints on the diary and get a formal identification that this was Leanne Tiernan.
After months of hoping and praying for Leanne's safe return, it was time to tell the family.
The news that they'd been dreading and fearing for 9 months was now suddenly upon them. And I've nothing but admiration for the stoicism, the absolute dignity that Mum and Dad showed at that moment in time.
DSI Gregg was more determined than ever to hunt down Leanne's killer. Back at the mortuary, Peter Grant's team called in an expert in insects, known as an entomologist.
Within the forensic world, we use entomologists to assist with time of death. When someone dies and they're left outside, there is a clearly defined pattern of insects being attracted to the body, and they'll lay their eggs on the body. And the state at which those insects are present can give an indication of how long the body has been dead.
The entomologist quickly made a pivotal discovery.
He was identifying insects that wouldn't normally turn up until a few weeks after a body has started decomposing. They tend to turn up, certain insects come first, then others, then others. He was getting some of the later insects. Maybe this body had been frozen, in that when you have a frozen piece of food and you defrost it, it tends to go off quicker, and there's a similar process happening here.
Investigators believe Leanne could only have been buried where she was found for 1 week, meaning she'd been kept somewhere else the rest of the time. The big question was, Where?
This was as sinister as it gets. A young girl clearly been kidnapped. Where, we still believed was in that Huflegill area. But had been kidnapped, taken somewhere. Was it in the area she was now disposed of, or was it nearer to Bramley? These were all investigative considerations which we were still to find the answer to. For us as the investigation team, there were some really good forensic opportunities here, and we weren't going to let those opportunities go.
Leanne had been missing for more than 6 months, but the police never gave up trying to find her. And then when her body was discovered after 9 months, the missing persons case turned into the hunt for her depraved killer, who police and the Forensic Science Service team were determined to bring to justice.
With the suggestion that Leanne had been frozen or stored somewhere, it became important to, we wanted to know where that was, and I'd established on previous cases that one way of doing this was to look at nasal washings from bodies, because this gives you an idea of where people took their last breath, in effect.
Immediately, pollen expert Dr. Patricia Wiltshire was contacted.
I was called in to get pollen from her to see if I could envisage the sort of place that she had been. Now, we know she'd been buried in this woodland, but had she been anywhere else? Had she been kept anywhere else before she'd been put in the woodland?
Palynology, or the study of plant pollen and spores, was a tool police used quite often.
You've got pollen and spores in the environment, in a sort of mixture. And if someone goes along and picks them up, they will have certain mixtures of pollen, different amounts of different types of pollen, different types of spores on them. And then I know where these plants live and function, so I can envisage a sort of place they've come from. And if I do that, it helps the police find places.
Dr. Wiltshire went to the mortuary in Harrogate.
I irrigated her nasal passages because sometimes people breathe in pollen very deeply up into the nasal passages, right up into the top of the nose. So I irrigated those out, and I also washed her hair very carefully. And from those washings, I was able to get assemblages of pollen grains and spores that her hair had picked up. Later, I worked on the duvet cover, and what I found on the duvet cover matched up with what I found in the ant's hair. And I had pollen, plant spores, I got fungal spores. I also got the conducting elements in wood, of conifers and of flowering trees, woody plants. And they were charred. There was a lot of microscopic charred material. And I assumed, therefore, that she'd been in contact with something that had been burnt. It seemed like a bonfire because there was hardwood and softwood.
Armed with this information, Dr. Wiltshire began envisioning the sort of place Leanne had been to pick up these materials.
I said to the police that I thought it was a very neglected and downtrodden garden, that it had a bonfire in it. And I was also able to say that there was a privet hedge, there was probably either a plum or a damson tree close by, and also the ground area was very, very neglected with brambles and all sorts of plants that are weeds, really.
With Dr. Wiltshire's incredible insight, police just needed to find a suspect with a garden that matched. Unfortunately, not all the forensics was going their way.
Leanne's body, with the decomposition, had completely obliterated the potential for DNA and fingerprints on the items that she was encased in. But there were other opportunities that we considered really, really significant.
One of these was the duvet.
Unfortunately, although we did find some body fluids on this duvet, we weren't able to get any sort of DNA result, which was a major disappointment, I think, down partly to the condition of the body. Then we had to fall back on some other types of evidence from the duvet, and we noticed on there that there are a lot of animal hairs that look like dog hairs, all of a relatively similar colour and appearance, suggesting it all come from one dog.
The lack of DNA was a major concern.
We realised we had to fall back on some more traditional forensic methods and maybe build up a forensic picture that we could then use as an intelligence tool to identify an offender.
Detective Superintendent Gregg and his team went back to basics, hoping that something would point them in the direction of Leanne's killer.
The physical items which she was bound with, the cable ties, who'd manufactured them? Where were they being distributed or sold these? Who had possession of them and for what purpose? There was a yellow one, 2 black ones, and the one that had been used as a ligature, the neutral coloured ones. What's the provenance of these? We don't know until we start drilling down and finding out.
While the police got on with discovering where the cable ties and dog collar came from, Peter Grant and his team continued putting together their forensic picture.
We built up a jigsaw, if you like, of different pieces of forensic evidence. We had the twine, we had fibres, we had dog hair.
The items themselves mean nothing. It's only when you start finding out the backstory to the items that suddenly they become relevant. The fibre that was found on Leanne's back, we found out that that was a carpet fibre. And we got experts in Bradford, which is in the textile heart of the north, to help us with this. And they gave us the type of carpet that had very likely come from.
All of this forensic evidence needed a suspect to be of use. Then the dog hair on the duvet grabbed the team's attention.
From the dog hair point of view, although we could tell it was dog hair, we did notice that some of these hairs had quite decent roots, that if it was a human hair, we'd think, well, we could DNA test that.
The problem was no one had ever DNA tested dog hair in the UK. Then Peter Grant made an interesting discovery.
I found out that at that time there was a university in America that had actually established a method to carry out DNA testing on dog hair, so that was our next port of call, with a view to potentially doing some sort of dog mass screen DNA.
If it came off, it could be the break police needed. And that wasn't all. Information about the cable ties used to bound and strangle Leanne had been unearthed.
We found out where they were all manufactured, and 3 of them seemingly took us nowhere. But one of them, we thought this could be interesting. It was the yellow cable tie, manufactured by a UK company, and millions made. And so you think, seemingly, this is going to take us nowhere. But what was interesting about this, as opposed to the others, was that 90% of these were used by the Royal Mail. Could this be somebody who's got connections with the Royal Mail? Maybe, maybe not.
The twine used to tie up the plastic bags also had a story to tell.
It was a unique twine that had been put together from a forensic perspective, was absolutely terrific. You know, because you knew that if you could find more of that twine, you were going to match it up.
The team's momentum continued.
The leather dog collar around her neck. We looked at this dog collar, manufactured in Nottingham. And it was a dog collar that many millions were sold worldwide. So we knew it was a long shot. We worked out there were X number of pet shops in Leeds that sold these dog collars. We went to every pet shop. We asked them the question, we got nowhere.
While DSI Gregg's team chased long shots, Peter Grant had gone to America with the dog hair to extract its DNA.
After a couple of days working with them, we were actually able to identify they had a reasonable method and that this was worth a go, and we carried out the test on 2 of our dog hairs, and we did obtain a decent dog DNA profile.
Now police could organise the UK's first mass dog screening in the hope of identifying Leanne's killer. Unaware of this result, police in West Yorkshire were looking at the 120 dog collar wholesalers in the UK.
113 were checked, And the detective got the answer back each time saying, no, no, no. Pet shop, pet shop, pet shop. We supplied her. Company 114, based in Liverpool, gave an answer that the detective wasn't expecting, which was, yes, we do sell those dog collars. And yes, we do have a customer, a private customer in Leeds who bought one. In fact, bought 6 and paid for it on a credit card.
This was the moment DSI Greg and his team had been praying for.
And have you got the name of that customer? Yes. It's a Mr. J. Taylor at Armley, Leeds. Thank you very much.
With that, 10 months after her disappearance, the investigation into the sickening murder of Leanne Tiernan finally had a suspect. The investigation into what was now the brutal murder of 16-year-old schoolgirl Leanne Tiernan from Bramley in Yorkshire finally had the breakthrough police had been looking for. The dog collar found around Leanne's neck had led police to a John Taylor from Leeds.
We found out he worked for a company called Parcel Force, which is part of the Royal Mail. He was living at home on his own in the adjoining township of Armley, which is adjacent to Bramley. He'd been divorced for 4 years, had some children, but they didn't live with him. He'd never been in trouble with the police. People knew him as John the Pet Man. He seemingly kept himself to himself, but we quickly found out that he had a bit of a nocturnal life as a poacher, liked to go out poaching.
The connection between the dog collar and ready access to Royal Mail cable ties was too much to ignore. On the 16th of October 2001, almost 10 months after Leanne's disappearance, police made their move and arrested John Taylor.
Of course, he denied any connection with Leanne, or having done anything wrong, and was denying that he'd had certain pets or animals because we were interested in pets that he'd had with our animal DNA that we were also trying to link.
News of the arrest soon travelled around the area.
It was a real shock because, you know, he was a neighbour. You know, you said hello to him. He used to sell pet food and my kids used to go over to his house to buy pet food for the rabbits. And it was just a real shock.
John Taylor was taken for questioning, and the Forensic Science Services team methodically searched his house.
The immediate thing that struck us was that there were no carpets in the house. It's just bare floorboards everywhere. But it did appear that, certainly in some rooms, that he'd only recently taken up the carpets. And we actually identified that some of the tufts of carpet still clinging onto nails in the corners of rooms were actually the same red fibres we'd found adhering to Leanne's jumper.
The evidence police needed kept on coming.
The black cable tie that had been used to bind Leanne's hands, we found some broken ones on the fence in the garden outside, exactly the same manufacture and code. We found 2 more dog collars in the house that was still there, that matched the same dog collar that had led us to John Taylor's door in the first place.
Also during the search there was some rabbit netting found. John Taylor was quite into trapping animals, and the makeup of the twine used to make this rabbit netting was exactly the same as the twine that had been used to tie the green bags.
So all the critical items that to him were so insignificant, suddenly were now coming back to haunt him.
With all this damning evidence mounting up, the forensic team called in Dr. Wiltshire.
I travelled up to Yorkshire, went into the garden, and it was amazing. The garden was so much like I'd envisaged. I just couldn't believe it. But there were 2 bonfires. There were the remains of 2 bonfires. But the elements that I found in Leanne's hair and on the duvet were on the left-hand side of the garden. Also, to approach that area, you had to go under a sort of archway, and there was a big, it was either a plum or a damson. There were no flowers on it, no fruits, but I knew it was a plum or a damson. And of course, I'd found that pollen. I'd found the plum and damson pollen. I'd found all these plants that were in the hedge and around, and all these weeds on the ground. I'd found the remnants of a bonfire in a hair, and I could say, it's on the left-hand side of the garden, not the right-hand side. And it just all came to life for me at that minute.
Dr. Wilshire's accuracy was astonishing. At the police station, Taylor continued to be interviewed.
Faced with this overwhelming evidence, which we now had against him, he said he admitted he'd killed her, but tried to claim it was an accident.
John Taylor then gave his version of events.
He had gone to Huffley Gill that Sunday afternoon with his dog to take the dog for a walk, when he saw a young girl walking down the path. He grabbed the girl, told her not to scream. He had a scarf which he tied around her eyes as a blindfold, took his coat off and put it on the girl and pulled the hood up.
Incredibly, at approximately 5 p.m. on Sunday the 26th of November, John Taylor then walked a terrified Leanne Tiernan the 22 minutes back to his house through an estate and even over a busy road.
She was now in the clutches of this predator.
Once at his house, he took her upstairs and tied her hands with cable ties.
She kicked out at him, and he grabbed her, and he says she fell on the floor and banged her head, and there was blood all over the place. And that's how she died.
It was a story that contradicted the evidence.
Now, he had a problem explaining how Leanne hadn't died from a head injury. She'd died from strangulation. The cable tie that was used to kill her had been pulled to such an extent, so tight it was only 10 centimetres in diameter. He hadn't killed her by accident. He'd strangled her.
John Taylor was doing his best to avoid a murder charge, but DSI Greg wasn't about to let that happen.
We put an identity parade together, and the lady who'd seen the man with the dog hanging around, talking to children, who she was uneasy about, picked him out.
The identification was a persuasive argument for the police's case that this had been a well-planned crime. But there was one crucial bit of evidence missing.
One of the more grim aspects of the scene was that a dog was buried in the garden. And this was a dog that had essentially been hit over the head with a shovel, it appeared. And unfortunately, the dog was in such, again, advanced state of decay that it wasn't suitable for us to DNA test, so we just decided not to pursue that line in the end.
It was a blow that, despite all the effort, the dog DNA was unusable. Officers carried on questioning Taylor.
He denied freezing Leanne's body, but we know it was frozen through the medical evidence. What his story was that after he'd killed her, he didn't know what to do with her body. So to start with, he took it into the back garden and put Leanne's body under a lot of pallets and tried to hide it that way until he could think what to do with her.
Police knew for certain that Leanne had been frozen. They just didn't know why.
Maybe he considered it wiser to actually keep the body inside his house than to put it in the landscape that was currently undergoing a very thorough search.
Another theory was that John Taylor kept Leanne frozen as a morbid trophy he could continually revisit for his grotesque pleasure. Next, he claimed he took her to Lindley Wood just days after killing her.
We know that Leanne's body had only been in the woods for a maximum of a week, and there was a witness who saw a man a week before the body was found lifting a bundle out of the boot of a car that matched John Taylor's description, that matched the description of his car, taking it into the woods.
John Taylor was charged, and then on the 8th of July 2002, over 18 months after 16-year-old Leanne Tiernan went missing, he stood trial at Leeds Crown Court for her kidnap and murder. Faced with the overwhelming evidence against him, he changed his plea.
Taylor had been trying to minimise his part in Leanne's death, claiming it was an accident, an unfortunate accident. But right at the end, he knew he had to face the prosecution case.
It was a great relief to the family not having to go through a whole trial, and he was convicted.
He was described as a sadistic sexual predator by the judge, told he would never be released from prison. That changed, of course, with the new Sentencing Act. He was sentenced to 30 years. But that's the calibre of this individual. He's a killer, shows no remorse. Not once would he have had any compassion for this young girl in his clutches, only what he wanted to do with her.
The local community welcomed the news.
I think there was a sense of relief after it had all come to a head, that somebody had been prosecuted for this crime. But I don't think an area can ever go back to the same again, because you're always wary of other things that might happen.
I would find it hard to forgive him, although we have to forgive him. Obviously an evil man. He'd planned to get somebody, and Leanne just happened to be there. And a cruel man. All the dead animals that he'd just battered to death. I can't understand him.
After 12 months of frustration and dead ends, Leanne's killer had finally been brought to justice.
The case that was built by the whole team was one that there was no wriggle room for John Taylor whatsoever. And I think that's just testament to the professional and thorough job that everyone on this case did.
You don't often witness where killers of this propensity and cruelty are, here in front of you, being sentenced, and the words poured on them from the bench. But whilst it did bring to an end one part of the investigation into John Taylor, it wasn't the final chapter. Because in our minds there was more to tell. This couldn't be the first time that he'd done this.
As a result of Leanne's murder inquiry, police reopened at least 10 cold case investigations looking at Taylor, convinced this wasn't a one-off. And less than a year after his conviction, Taylor pleaded guilty to 2 separate rapes. The question is, what else was he guilty of?
Uncover more dark secrets that go on behind closed doors. Killer in My Village is weeknights at 11 on Sky Mix.